I've got Adam Carricker of the Carricker Chronicles and the Big Ten Show. I appreciate you for joining me today. Let's talk a little bit of realignment, my favorite subject, and
Let's
certainly the
do
most
it.
entertaining thing in college football right now, at least until the games get played. We talked a little bit in the last video about how Oregon, USC, Washington, UCLA, how you kind of expected them to do. So we won't maybe dive into that as far. But how weird is it to have them in the Big Ten, the West Coast teams coming all the way over to the Midwest, or as a guy that grew up in Washington, does it feel just perfectly natural to you?
Oh, it doesn't feel natural at all. It's incredibly weird. USC, UCLA, Oregon, like what? And then there's an entire conference, as we know, that doesn't even exist anymore. And then you got Washington State and Oregon State. I don't know, or they're just in the Milky Way galaxy, floating somewhere, doing something. I know there's a lot of connection to them in the Big 12 potentially. For me, it's interesting. It's going to be fun to watch. It's going to be fun to see name brand teams play name brand teams way more often. And geography doesn't matter at all anymore, obviously. But to me, it's going to be very weird, yet very entertaining to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody in the country, and I know this can be played out of conference and has been recently, but nobody in the country is upset with getting to see Oregon and Ohio State go at it early in the year. Shoot, they might go at it two more times as the year goes on. Hopefully not. I mean, a rematch would be one thing in the Big Ten, but yeah, nobody's upset about that, right? Nobody's upset about seeing Georgia go down to Texas, right? And play that kind of game, or Oklahoma and Alabama. Like, yeah, bring on all of that kind of stuff. Now, it still feels weird. Texas maybe a little less weird in the SEC than Washington or UCLA or some of these teams in the Big Ten. But yeah, I think the matchups that you're going to get out of it make it a lot of fun. And then just the ever evolving landscape, which we'll talk about in a minute, kind of makes it fun too.
It's funny because I look at like just Georgia's schedule. Okay. And I know that's SEC, but they start off with Clemson. Then they've got Alabama eventually down the road, and Texas and Ole Miss, who's like a preseason top 5 or 6 team, and Tennessee. And then, oh, by the way, Georgia Tech's an afterthought, their big rival game every year.
Florida too,
So
yeah.
it's crazy some of the matchups that we're going to see, and frankly, how unkind the schedule makers were to Georgia. Like I've seen where people have won the national title, but not even in the SEC title game, just because of the brutal SEC schedule. But it's going to be fun to watch as a fan.
Yeah. This is maybe more of a big picture question. There's a lot of chatter around AAU membership with teams potentially joining the Big Ten, what's required, what's not. And I want to talk about those teams in a minute. But obviously Nebraska right now, not AAU accredited. Is that something they're working towards? Do they not care? Does the Big Ten not care anymore because they're already in? What are the thoughts around that?
That is something they're working towards with the crazy way college football is and the conference landscape is, and the way you have no idea what the heck's going to happen half the time. You don't want to give anybody a reason. Of course, I don't see any reason for the Big Ten not to want Nebraska. And I say that from a brand standpoint, a money standpoint, from an appeal standpoint, especially if Matt Rule can get Nebraska winning games again. But I kind of look around and sometimes I wonder, I'm like, all right, they're getting picky with who they're going to add to the conference. Are they going to look for reasons to get teams out of conferences and get bigger pieces of the pie to the name brand teams in the conference by eliminating some of the not so recognizable teams in those conferences in the Big Ten? No disrespect, but potentially to a team like, are you still there? Oh, sorry. I thought I lost you for a second. To a team, I don't know, I'm just going to pluck one out. Purdue. They had a rough year last year. But if you're not bringing in an equal piece to the pie, there's an argument to be made that maybe we don't keep you around. For right now, that's only been thrown out there here or there. If you're Nebraska, you're like, they have no reason to not try to keep us or want us or believe that we won't contribute outside the AAU thing. So I don't think, let's be honest, it's about money. College football is about money. It's been that way forever. Now people are just very out front about it. They're not hiding it at all. They're making it beyond obvious what everyone's known behind the scene for years. But if anybody's going to try to find a way or a reason, it would be that AAU thing. So they are working towards it, but I'm not uber concerned.
Yeah. And I agree with you on that. I just think that I think they'd probably just say like, hey, you need to get this done so that we don't have to, it wouldn't be like, by the way, you're out. Sorry. All right, Florida State and Clemson, kind of the talk of where realignment is right now. obviously Florida State specifically, some really old fun matchups with Nebraska back in the day. In fact, I saw some of the highlights. Yesterday was 17 days until Florida State plays that week 0 game. And so I watched a Charlie Ward highlight, a couple of games against Nebraska that he played. Old matchups. I assume the fans in Lincoln would be pretty pro FSU joining the Big Ten.
Oh, I think so, absolutely. By the way, Charlie Ward went on and played, what was it, 12 years in the NBA.
Ridiculous.
Not getting to see him in an NFL on an NFL field was just it's one of the
Or
big
today's
misses of.
offenses like
Oh
Lamar,
man,
like
are you kidding me? One of the big misses of my personal lifetime. I mean, he was probably my favorite non-Nebraska player growing up in all of college football.
yeah.
As far as Clemson and FSU, it's crazy to me when people are like, and everyone's playing it close to the vest right now. You've got 50 million lawsuits between all these ACC teams and the ACC themselves, and I'm rounding down when I make that number up. But my point is simply this: like, who wouldn't want Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina? And I know Virginia's tossed out there a lot, but if you're going to add teams like Maryland and Rutgers, with all due respect to the Big Ten, that's about money, not about necessarily wins and losses on the field. So why would Virginia be seen any differently?
Sure.
So to me, I don't know why anybody wouldn't want Florida State and Clemson. And I know, like the SEC, for example, they've already got Florida and they've already got South Carolina, but it's about name brand recognition. You get Clemson versus Texas. You get Florida State versus Oklahoma. You can't tell me that's not appealing across the country and bringing more eyeballs to the SEC, or Florida State, Nebraska, or potentially Clemson, Michigan. Okay. And so for me, I think any conference would be lucky to have those teams. North Carolina, they've got kind of the pain in the butt little brother that has a hold on them known as NC State, but they may be the most sought after brand in the entire ACC. And then I do think Virginia is kind of in there as well. And I'm rooting for Miami to go to the Big 12 because I want the Big 12 to have some sway and some pull and some interest and intrigue as well.
Miami to the Big 12 would be interesting. I think I almost wonder like if they'd have to work on that revenue share, how that would work. Also, Miami has an insane amount of money where I think they actually could survive, the Big 12 from a financial perspective. What I would worry about for Miami is is going over there and not a shot at the Big 12. I know I've gotten yelled at for stuff like this before, but just a recognition thing. Like if you're Florida State's fight right now, I think, and Clemson's is mostly about money. And I know there's the automatic qualifiers and stuff, but are you always going to be like that second fiddle? Part of Florida State's fight also is just hey, we can't win in the AC, like went 13-0 and got left out, it's like, so I do kind of wonder about that from Miami's perspective. I think they would fit in the Big 12 fine. I think they'd fit in the Big 10 fine. I think some Ohio State matchups with Miami would be a ton of fun. Nebraska would be an old one too. Miami Penn State would be one that I think would be a ton of fun. Obviously, Cristobal playing his old team if they are up and going in Oregon. Miami USC, oh my goodness. But that thought is insane too. And you talk about like these matchups. And all of those that I mentioned actually probably move me a little more than like Miami Alabama, Miami Georgia. I'm sure they'd be great. Like that's not me to say that those wouldn't be fun games. Miami Oklahoma, Miami Texas would be one, but man, some of those Big Ten matchups with Miami would be a ton of fun. Because we all live. Part of college football is the nostalgia of it. Part of it's like remembering how you grew up and what oh man, I remember the triple overtime game against Penn State that we lost. Florida State lost.
I remember that.
And so it's just like you remember all of those matchups from the 80s and 90s and early 2000s that you'd get back, and that so rarely happen now. So maybe when we have a Super League in 10 years, that we'll get even more of that stuff. But Miami is an interesting one, and where do they land? Where they fit? Can they capitalize on a good year this year? I spoke with Manny Navarro of The Athletic, and I said, like, where's their place in realignment? And he said they just need to take care of themselves. Like, they need to start winning again and stop being a pile of dog crap, and then it might matter. But right now, who wants them, And so I'd say, well, it's still the brand and stuff. But Miami's an interesting one to me for sure. If you had to predict it right now, where do you think Florida State Clemson land?
It's tough.
I know. I won't hold you to it either.
No, it's because I have thought about this, honestly. I do see, I'll actually start with North Carolina and Virginia. I actually see them going to the SEC because I think the SEC probably wants them maybe a little bit more from a monetary value standpoint. something in me sees Clemson and Florida State going to the Big Ten. And it's funny because I'm a football guy. I know this is all about money. I fully well understand it. I just don't care because I'm not getting any of it. So I look at it from a football guy's perspective. If I'm a Big Ten person, I'm like, all right, prior to adding the West Coast teams, we had no pipeline to recruiting to Florida, Texas, or California. And those are the 3 hotbed states for recruiting. Now we've at least got something on the West Coast. We got a lot of something on the West Coast. I don't know that we can get into Texas, okay? But can we get into Florida? Not only from an exposure standpoint, from a brand versus brand matchup standpoint, which is going to create a lot of monetary revenue for our conference and our teams. But if we can get better as an overall conference and win more games as a conference, that starts with recruiting. If we could get into California and Florida, that could help our conference as a whole. So something about me is just, it appeals to me from a recruiting standpoint. It appeals to me because I think it's going to appeal to the Big Ten more even than the SEC, because the SEC does have teams there. So the Big Ten being able to get into the Southeast, they're in the Northeast, they're all along the West Coast. They're truly becoming a national they are coast to coast national brand, but not just in the Northeast, but now also to the Southeast, all the way to the West Coast. So I get the feeling they might be even more valuable to the Big Ten than the SEC.
Yeah, no, I think your logic's spot on. I think the Big Ten wants them more. It would be if ESPN and the SEC didn't want them to get away. And, played basically if they end up in the SEC, it's because the SEC played a lot of defense. Not that I don't think they're not valuable to the SEC. I mean, there's some value there, but I think the Big Ten wants them more. Does the SEC and ESPN want to block a little bit? So, Adam, where can people follow you? Where can they find more of your work?
You make such a great point. There's revenue. There's guys in suits making football decisions who don't care about football. They just care about money and TV ratings and TV revenue and ads. It's crazy, man. The people deciding things when it comes to what's happening on the field are not people who are really tied to what's happening on the field. And college football is just a crazy world. But where you can follow me is I have a show called The Character Chronicles. You can check out my YouTube page. All right, just type in Character Chronicles. You can go to characterchronicles.com. Also, the Big Ten Show on the Believe Podcast Network. Follow me on X, Instagram, Facebook as well.
Awesome. Thanks, buddy.